Hi again. F.F. Bruce, The Real Jesus, Chapter 10, Arrest and Trial. Here's Jesus before Pilate. The hearing before the Jewish court took place exceptionally by night. This was necessary if the process was to be completed before the official Passover. Besides, if it should prove necessary, as it did, to refer the case to the Roman governor, it had to be borne in mind that a Roman official began the day's business at about 6 a.m., and liked to get it over by 10 a.m. Pilate had probably been advised by the chief priestly party that they would probably be bringing a convicted person before him for sentence early in the morning. Pilate would not be greatly interested in the charge of blasphemy, a capital offense though it was in Jewish reckoning, but he could not overlook the charge of sedition. Since Jesus had virtually claimed to be King of the Jews, Pilate, it was hoped, would simply rubber stamp the decision of the high priest and his colleagues that Jesus had committed a capital offense and ordered the death sentence to be carried out. Instead, Pilate surprised them by formally opening a fresh trial and asking them, as prosecutors, to state their charge against Jesus. Pilate's right to conduct the case as he thought fit was unquestioned. Subject to the overriding authority of Roman law, a governor had complete discretion within his own province. When the chief priests protested that they had already judged the man to be a criminal, he told them to inflict the appropriate punishment that their own law prescribed. They protested again that they were unable to do this because their law prescribed the death penalty for the offense that had been committed. This they were prevented by Roman law from executing. But seeing that Pilate was virtually opening a fresh trial, they framed their charge against Jesus in terms of which Pilate would take immediate cognizance. They charged him with claiming to be king of the Jews. They were already to testify that they had heard him make this claim in their presence. Pilate, accordingly, turned to Jesus and invited him to reply to the charge. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. Of all four evangelists, it is John who follows most closely here the regular procedure of a Roman trial, combining, after his fashion, historical accuracy with theological interpretation. He provides theological interpretation at this point by transposing Jesus' reply to Pilate's question in such a way as to bring out the true nature of Jesus' kingship. Jesus, in fact, is represented by John as doing before Pilate something of the same kind as Mark says he did before the high priest. He does not repudiate the term king, is totally inadmissible, just as he did not repudiate the high priest's word Messiah. But if you are talking of kings and kingdoms, he added, in effect, the kingdom with which I am concerned is the kingdom of truth, and my subjects are those who love the truth. That's John 18:33-38. As C.H. Dodd put it, to the first readers of John's Gospel, 60 years after the event, it was a matter of purely academic interest who was not king of the Jews in AD 30, but the question where ultimate truth is to be found can never cease to be of moment to people who take life seriously. Pilate may or may not have been interested in such questions, more probably not, but they had nothing to do with the matter in hand, he reckoned. So he dismissed the subject with an impatient, "What is truth?" Jesus, to his way of thinking, was a harmless lunatic, not the stuff of which rebels were made. If he were flogged and then dismissed with a caution, that would meet the situation. Before any further action was taken, however, the question of the customary release of a prisoner at Passover tide was raised. There is no unambiguous reference to this customary release anywhere outside the New Testament. Within the New Testament, all four evangelists mention it. In particular, both Mark and John mention it. This means that we have two independent lines of evidence for it. The custom was, we are told, that the governor released at Passover any single prisoner for whom the people asked. Possibly this was a custom taken over by the Roman governors from previous rulers of Judea. Probably it was intended to commemorate the release of the people's ancestors from their servitude in Egypt. We do not know. On this occasion, Pilate hoped that they might ask for Jesus' release. He was taken by surprise when the crowd of bystanders shouted, "Not him, we want Barabbas." Barabbas really was the stuff of which rebels were made. He had recently been seized after participating in an insurgent outbreak in which blood had been shed. But plainly he was regarded as a popular hero, a bold freedom fighter. His release was therefore sought and granted. The insurgent was set free. The preacher of peace and non-resistance was convicted of insurgency. The irony of the situation is brought out by the evangelists. It was probably not lost on Pilate himself. Jesus then was handed over to the soldiers for a flogging. They improved the occasion by dressing him up in mock coronation robes and pretending to pay him homage in ridicule of his alleged claim to be king of the Jews. John tells how Pilate then presented him, dressed up as he was, to the chief priests in expectation that they would be satisfied that Jesus offered no more threat to anyone. But they resented Pilate's scarcely veiled hint that this sorry figure was a worthy king of them and their nation, and they refused to give up pressing their charge. For a moment, however, they changed the terms of the charge. If Pilate did not take seriously Jesus' alleged claim to be king of the Jews, they insisted that the terms in which he claimed to be the Son of God amounted to a serious offense in Jewish law, deserving the death sentence. They demanded that Pilate should exercise his authority by directing that the death sentence be carried out. But after a further brief interrogation of Jesus, Pilate showed himself equally unwilling to satisfy them on that score either. But then they played their last card. Never mind about the charge of blasphemy then, they said in effect. Come back to the charge of sedition. Anyone who claims to be a king in one of the imperial provinces infringes Caesar's authority. If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. On at least one occasion since his arrival as governor, Pilate's tactlessness, not to use a harsher word, had caused the Jewish authorities to send a complaint about him to Rome, and the complaint had been treated seriously. But no complaint would be treated so seriously as a report that he had discharged a man who, as the chief priests would testify, had been guilty of seditious language. The Emperor Tiberius was a notoriously suspicious character, and such a report would not go down at all well with him. Pilate's mind was made up for him, and he pronounced the death sentence. John describes in detail the time and place of the passing of the death sentence. It was towards noon on Friday of Passover week, he says. The trial had taken longer than expected. The raised platform or tribunal had been set up in the courtyard of Government House, the Praetorium, in an area called the Pavement or the Plain Stones. Pilate sat down in his chair of office on the platform and sentenced Jesus to death by crucifixion. And finally, he has a paragraph or two on secular and spiritual authority. John dramatizes the confrontation, as to some extent the other evangelists also do. Here are two forms of authority. Pilate is vested with secular authority, the authority of the world ruler whose lieutenant he is. He has armed force at his disposal, adequate to carry out his commands. Jesus represents a kingdom not of this world. The authority at his disposal is that of the Father who sent him into the world. What can such authority avail against Roman military might? To outward appearance it can avail nothing. Jesus is seized and led off to the place of execution. But the evangelists, by the time they came to tell their story, knew better. Jesus' authority was asserted in his submission to injustice, brutality, and death. And it was his authority, not Pilate's, that was vindicated in the event. Even Pilate's authority, and the imperial power from which it was derived, could be exercised only by the permission of God. And in this instance, the exercise of Pilate's authority was overruled for the furtherance of God's saving purpose in the world. Pilate sat in the judge's chair, and Jesus stood condemned before him. But the evangelists knew, in common with other Christians, that Jesus is the divinely appointed judge of the living and the dead, and that it was really Pilate and Jesus' chief priestly accusers who were on trial before him. But that is not how it appeared at the time. That's the end of the chapter, Arrest and Trial. Next time, the Crucified King. I'll put in a link to the only references to the kingdom in the Gospel of John. It's astounding for at least Jehovah's Witnesses to contemplate this, that the kingdom is only referenced in two places. One is what's been named here, Pontius Pilate at the trial, and the other one is in the garden Nicodemus coming to Jesus by night. I'll put in that video for you on Nicodemus and Jesus in the garden. See you soon.